when we were doing the tech check today, Dipti is like, Rashmi, you don't need an introduction, right? And I said, no. So we save on 2 minutes. So just before we begin the session today, I just wanted us to go through these quotes to sort of ask ourselves the first question that I have for you. And if you have a paper and pen, or if you'd like to type it in the chat window, that's completely on you. I just wanted to take you through first the understanding of, that we have with respect to who's audience for us, who is an audience member, or rather, who are the audiences for us, for our work. What is our relationship with them? So there is obviously no single one definition for it, right? So someone like Florian, the audience is a voyeur, or for that matter, when we're looking at a Don DeLue, for him, the audience is a muse, an ideal. For Charlie Chaplin, the audience is misunderstood, and the audience understands. And for some others, not having an audience is a void. So when you look at your relationship with the audience, what comes to your mind? And I'd like us to take just about 20 seconds to just, if you can, close your eyes. Would be great. Just take 20 seconds to just take a deep breath and hold on for 20 seconds and ask yourself this question: is if you have to pick one or two words for what is an audience for you, what would that be? And I'm gonna time this, and then we'll come back and then we'll begin the session. So just about 20 seconds, 20 odd seconds. All right, I hope you've had a chance to think through, write it down if you have a pen or paper, or in the chat window. I'm gonna move on. So with that, welcome everyone. I hope you're feeling good about today's session. It's the second last session for the program. And I just want to begin by taking you through what is it that we are covering today. We are, to begin with, looking at what the existing approaches to audiences are at the moment. And first of all, for all of those who filled the form, the quiz that was sent out, thank you so much for using some of those examples today. But more importantly, it was for you to sort of reflect upon your relationship with your audiences. And that's what we're going to be using while dealing with this first section on looking at the grammar and the lexicon that is currently used in the space of audience development overall. We will then move on to talking about what do you look at, what factors do you consider when you're talking about digital audiences, and what are the dynamics within the physical and the digital realm that we're struggling with or perhaps dealing with at the moment. And finally, what I thought would be good is to sort of also reflect upon the last few sessions that we've had, led by Padmini, Archana, Nishant, and Achal, about certain aspects of what they've touched upon when it comes to your relationship, your work's relationship with the receiver. And just thought we could sort of deal a little bit with the provocations that you've been engaging with over the last few sessions. So this is how we're hoping to cover today for you, the next 2 hours for you. To begin with, just wanted to introduce a few basic concepts of what does it mean when we talk about audience development. So generally, when you're talking about audience development, it's a massive umbrella term, and it speaks about any kind of activity that's created or undertaken for current and future or potential audiences. And this covers the entire cycle of your relationship with them, your needs, your goals, what are their needs, what are their desires, so that you're able to develop an ongoing relationship with them. So this covers a wide spectrum of everything from marketing. It impacts your programming, your touch points, your customer care with them. The whole space of education is also covered under it. And of course, distribution channels. So this is the entire umbrella idea of audience development. However, what we're going to do here, we're going to try and split up these terminologies a little bit and try and deal with them with these sort of soft boundaries, even though you may be using it very variedly. So when we talk about audience development today, aside from the umbrella term, we're also going to be talking about audience development as a tactical approach, which is largely talking about how is it that we engage with audiences as a part of a marketing strategy, where our desires and our needs to connect with them is purely from the perspective of immediate results. So this could be sales, donations, ticket, all of that kind of stuff. So that's audience development. What I'm going to do next is just since you all have had a chance to fill the form, well, not all, some of you, we just picked up some data from there to help you understand this notion of audience development. So we'd asked you, why is it that you reach out to your audience? And these were from 22 responses. Uh, a lot of you had said that to inform and update them about our shows. So it's a very tactical reason. It's connected to the marketing space of your work. A lot of them tick that. And also, just to let you know that these weren't multiple choice. You could have multiple check boxes. So you could tick as many as you wanted to. So you've obviously looked at what matters to you most, or what's the reason that you're engaging with them. What's the goal for engaging with them? You also looked at donating as one area. I think the 54.5% was the second one, which was also had to do with just letting them know, or selling tickets was the second one. So just to sort of give a sense of why is it that we connect with our audience, and which realm does it fall under. We'd also asked you, how often do you connect with them and how do you connect with them? So the frequency, the channels is what is covered in this area. A lot of you mentioned social media as a key one. While pulling this graph from the form, they have not put in a couple of fields, but the second highest here seems to be direct messaging through WhatsApp and SMSs. That's what was 72.7%. And the 27.3% that you again see missing is print collateral. Just, I wanted to look at the last two ones, which is feedback sessions and surveys and in-person meetings. And for me, this was interesting because there was an other option in here. So you had an option to, to put whatever you wanted to. And I thought this feedback sessions and surveys and in-person meetings was interesting because it sort of directly leads into what I want to talk about next, which is audience engagement. How is it different from audience development? Engagement is looking at how is it that we want to deepen a relationship with the audience. How do we want to engage with them as opposed to develop them towards a specific goal or agenda? And this engagement sort of covers a much more long-term orientation to your approach, and hence it is more strategic. So what would typically be covered in engagement will also have to do with or impact your programming, your education, the activities that you undertake in the education space is also what's connected in audience engagement. So when you spoke earlier about feedback sessions and surveys and in-person meetings, for me, it directly connected to your desire to engage with the audience, to look at the more long-term agenda of engaging with the audience. I'm going to pick up a few more data points that you had shared with us. We'd asked you the question of what keeps you awake at night about your audience. And the rating was you were supposed to sort of have given how urgent that particular field was for you. So the highest was 5, like this is how urgent or how much this bothers me. And if you notice the 5s, how to grow my audience base, and this is obviously coming from you, so this is your data, about how to grow my audience base, which was for you the biggest concern, along with how to build my community. The second thing, I mean, if you see the 4s are also equally high, and if you look at these 3 seem to be the highest. So again, how to keep my current audiences coming back. So repetition, retention, how to convert them to paying audiences. So of course, revenue generation is a key concern, but audience growth continues to be quite high up for you in terms of your needs in relation to that. The third area that I wanted us to sort of think about is audience segmentation. I know that some of you in your forms have mentioned the word audience segmentation. So I know that you're engaging with it in your work to a certain extent, perhaps if not a lot more. The segmentation space essentially asks you to categorize your audiences, split them as per their characteristics and their needs, and allow that entire process allowing you to look at your development and engagement needs in varied ways. So as an example, if you are a theater group that has a desire to build audiences and look at audiences across various age groups, you may have an active school program. So that's one of your audience segments is going to be young audiences. And hence your goals for both development and engagement are going to differ on the basis of who you are speaking to. I'm going to again, take some data from the quiz that we had shared with you. What does the segmentation contain? Demographics. So we had asked you, what's the age of your audience? Something that I thought was quite interesting is a lot of you said not sure, which I thought was quite fascinating because, maybe it's a question that you haven't dealt with, or maybe you felt that you need to think a little more about actually where does your audience really fit in terms of age. We had also asked you about location. Where are they based? Are they in the immediate vicinity of your venue? Are they in the same city? Are they located internationally? What about them traveling into your city and coming to your space specifically? For instance, if you're the National Museum, it's very likely that a lot of people will come from other cities and different parts of the world into National Museum as well as within your own city. So understanding the location of where they are coming from and how does that impact therefore your engagement and development goals. What languages do they speak? In a country like India, that becomes even more important. And how much do we know about the languages that they speak? How much money do they earn? What does their bank balance look like? What does their net value, income, and economic potential look like? And how does that impact perhaps everything from how you price your tickets to your shows to how do you raise donations? How do you convert your audiences into subscribers? To even as simple as how does it how does it relate in conflict with your desire to engage with a specific audience group? If you're a street theater group, do you care about an audience that's largely upper middle class? So just to sort of keep you real about who you're talking to, what's their paying potential, but also more importantly, are you actually speaking to the right audience who may not get the kind of opportunities that someone with a certain income bracket may get? And is that a core part of your values for your organization and your vision and mission of what you're trying to do? Coming back to this slide, which is on digital literacy, just understanding how literate your audience is digitally, whether they have access to certain tools that allows them to perhaps access content online. They may be literate but they may not have access. So just understanding where they are with their relationship with digital also falls into that space of understanding who your audience is. So these were some of the questions that we had asked you. Um, I want to talk a little bit more about segmentation. Aside from the fact that it allows you to divide up your audience a little bit, it also makes you ask certain questions of your audience, not just who they are at the moment, but who do you want them to be going forward. It allows you to draw that path for yourself. What characteristics do they have which are in common? Do they take certain purchase decisions? What are their motivations? What are their behaviors? All of which allows you to sort of figure out at what position to relate to them and engage with them on. I'm going to bring in an example here with a pinch of salt, and I'll speak about the pinch of salt a little later in the presentation, which is this sort of cultural segments by MHM Insights, which is Morris, Hargrave, and McIntyre. In the UK, they're a research agency that looks at audiences specifically. And they've done a lot of work with audiences in the UK for a very, very long time, and working with universities and teams of psychologists and sociologists, they've come up with these 8 cultural segments. Now, I'm going to again ask you to take this with a pinch of salt, because personally, I don't think this relates to the cultural segments that we have in India, but it was still a case for us to sort of think through while talking about segmentation. So these are the 8 categories that they have looked at. I'm deliberately not going over them because we will be coming back to them. The slide will also be coming back. They did a study in 2014, which was an India study. And they looked at, I think, 4,200 surveys is what they conducted in India to understand their cultural habits of these of these individuals. And this is how they looked at that market. So these were above 18 years old. They had at least engaged with culture once every in the past 3 years. And they also obviously break it down to current market, potential market, not in the market, and total market. Here is some data from them. 24% of the people that they had interviewed and surveyed have participated in cultural activity in 3 years, which to me, to be really honest, was a bit surprising, because knowing the amount of engagement we have in culture in India, And again, how is culture defined, right? Like in the UK, culture is defined very differently. For us, culture is very integral to our rituals and traditions and religions as well. So would you call Durga Puja cultural? Would you call Ganesh Utsav cultural? Where are those boundaries that are there? But for the sake of this discussion, I still wanted to bring this up. Uh, a key statistic that they brought up also is the average spend per person on culture, which was about 430 rupees, just trying to figure out the pegging of paying capacity. And for me, this was another interesting stat because they spoke about their relationship with digital and how would they look at digital. And 53% of them at that time said that internet is a great alternative if you can't attend in person. And something that really makes me think about if we had this data in 2014 much more widely accessible, and if some organization had chosen to act on this, how would we have dealt with a pandemic here that we've just dealt with today? So it's just something that I was smiling about when I was going through this study this year. I've been through the study 3 years ago as well. So the Indian market, according to them, as per their statistic, is these are the three main types or segments that they have identified that work in India. Expression. So these are people who are creative, enjoy being a part of a community, sharing and connecting with others. And this was the highest amount, 26% of that 67 million that they spoke about. Release was 16%. They have enjoyed arts in the past. They may have also engaged with the arts. So these could be people who've probably, attended theater in college or participated in some sort of a social cultural activity in college, but have sort of let go of that because of life pressures and work pressures. And that's something that they keep coming back to as a release, but not as a core motivation. 12% for stimulation. They like to be a part of the cultural space. It sort of resonates a little more with this notion of uh, sort of what we like to call cultural capital, having access to cultural capital. Like I would go to a festival because I've got tickets, I've got friends going, and it's a music that I like, but I also like the experience of it. And when I was putting this together, it reminded me of the entire sort of audience structure, that value structure that Achal spoke about, of connoisseurs, amateurs and novices, and you will see resonating through some of the data points that we'll bring up now. So just to sort of recap on those 8 categories, these were the 3 that they had identified: expression, release, and stimulation. I just thought you may want to take a look at the slide again. We had asked you some questions about what do you know about their audience? What do you know about their likes and dislikes? And this is what you have shared. So for now, I'm going to ignore the not sure, and I'm just going to ask you to look at the others. We had asked you about what you know about the behavior of your audience. And these were a few questions that we had put out, but this could be as exhaustive as you want it to be. You can add more layers to it if you really want to understand the segment of your audiences, or rather segment your audiences, thinking through what their behaviors, attitudes, likes, and dislikes are. Okay, at this point, are there any questions? I would recommend if you can, again, raise your hand, unmute, put yourself on video, that'll be great.
Yeah, I'm kind of liking this idea of audience, looking at them as audience and not as users, because in Social Dilemma, it kind of refers as, user is the only other industry where user is used other than tech is in addiction. So it's like in tech, which is the background I come from, we usually tend to look at them as node points or, points in the machine learning algorithm, or, it's quite dehumanizing. So I'm kind of very interested in this perspective of more humanizing your user slash what you're now calling as audience, because digitally they do our audiences, like they translate into from the offline world to the online world. And I'm kind of interested in those nuances of looking at them in a more culture-led way, like Archana was mentioning the other way, rather than looking at it in a very tech kind of dehumanized way. So I'm kind of interested about knowing your perspectives on that.
So that's actually the reason why I started off with those quotes, right? Like, why do we need an audience for the arts? Can art survive without the audience? These are questions that I've honestly, having worked in the art sector for the last decade, I have asked myself over and over again. Because for me, in a very core way, it relates to the value that not just you as someone who works in the cultural sector, as an artist, as a creative professional, is putting into the lives of people, but also the value that they think they are taking away. So those are my questions that keep me awake at night. And the question that therefore I keep asking myself is, if I'm going to look at the audience on the other side as one segment, and if I'm not going to be able to build a relationship with that segment, what am I doing in this sector? Then I might as well join, Srinidhi, as you said, the tech sector, where we're able to look at big pieces because we can achieve a lot of scale there. But I feel like somewhere we're always in this battle of the individual and the scale. And how can we, deal with that battle with a more humanistic approach? How can we think about a relationship to technology, to the arts, to culture, in a fashion that foregrounds and works with the motivations of people who are making and absorbing culture and arts? How can we sort of constantly frictionalize that relationship so that people are able to, in an egalitarian way, question themselves, their ideas, their motivations for doing whatever they do in life? I feel arts does that in society, and that plays a huge role. And hence, consciously, through much of our work, we stepped away from uh, thinking of audiences as data users or even big data. The struggle that happens when you're thinking about it like this in a very philosophical sense is, when you're dealing with analytics and when you're dealing with statistics, how do you bring that humanism in? And it's a struggle that we're still dealing with. And you may have seen, with some of the inputs that you shared, and how we're looking at those statistics, and to keep reminding ourselves to bring that back into the humanistic framework. And how do we do that? And this is where I feel like my biggest critical view of big data and analytics overall is that it's never complemented with qualitative research. So if you're able to keep going back to having those feedback sessions, having conversations with audiences, thinking through notions of communities as opposed to single audience members, how does that change our relationship with them? And how can we constantly respond uh, to them and them to us? So how can this be that two-way relationship that we have? It simply boils down to that we're not the tech, but we can be a part of so much more.
Right. But in my case, what's happening is I'm kind of really, my eyes have got opened in terms of not looking at them as the user from the first session onwards itself, where we kind of discussed as to how we don't need to reach everyone and we can reach a limited subset of people also on
Hmm.
digital. That's okay if we don't scale and so on. But
Yeah.
I'm now looking at it like, let's say, how do we, as a digital platform, how I can be trans inclusive, or I can, if in my event space which I run, I can have a ramp for the disabled. But now I'm like, oh God, our platform is not accessible to somebody who could be blind. And
Hmm.
questions are really bothering me now, questions that I'd never thought of earlier. So I'm, as much as I'm grateful for the the series of sessions that have made me think about these things, I'm not sure about the solutions and the approaches and the literature that is available for building very humanistic tech. So in that sense, and how do I get feedback? Like, how do I know my user is probably finding the platform not so accessible, or I need to do those surveys, or like, are there structures also? Like, there's just not enough literature around this stuff. At least I haven't come across any course that I could take or something. So I'd just be more than happy to kind of get to know more stuff around this.
Sure. So, two things, right? One is how much is available on this. There's actually a lot. And how can you find that information is, I'm going to plug Dara again, your peer group. Ask those questions of your peers, understand what everybody is doing, and see if you can work through some of the tools that they've recommended in that space. At the same time, one area that I've always found something that most people in the arts struggle with is just the overwhelming amount of information that's available out there. And I often find a good way to navigate through that information is asking yourselves what you want of that information. What are your goals in this process that you've begun for yourself? So, if your goals are going to be to make it inclusive, within that inclusion, what are the key things that you want to achieve? So, having a somewhat a goal centric approach allows you to sort of narrow your focus into what you want to get through first. Within that, to step out and look at a more egalitarian approach, which is something that can be built on, that can be expanded over time. You don't have to check all the boxes today. How can you sort of layer that conversation in an ongoing fashion? Like when you think about equality and diversity, it's so huge and it covers so many intersections. So if you're going to start tackling it in its entirety, it'll take several lifetimes for you to get to a point which actually, for the want of a better word, ticks all the boxes. Which is where we like to operate on something what we call as MVP model, which is minimum viable product. You start with something that you want to achieve, start with smaller goals, see how your process evolves in response to your activities, what is your ability in terms of resources, time, energy, that allows you to plug into that process. How do you bring feedback in, how do you bring monitoring and evaluation in while you're building in that process, so that you're able to improve upon that product as it goes along. So one example is this, right? I mean, digital culture management. I mean, there are no frameworks for this program. We started off by saying we want to build a program that's not just top down but bottom up. We didn't want Nishant and Padmini to give us a curriculum. We wanted Nishant, Padmini, Rashmi, Archana, Achal to come in with their inputs, their strengths, their ideas, get into the conversation through brainstorming sessions. We wanted to come to you as an audience member, as a direct stakeholder, to tell us what you want, which is what we did way back in July, August with those sessions. And then when we put together a curriculum for these 8 sessions, it was both bottom up and top down. It reflected what your needs are, but at the same time, what these facilitators and subject leads are telling us we need to think about in terms of nuances while building this program. When we got into this program, at every point we've looked at how is it that you're interacting with each other, how is it that you're feedbacking to us, and we're using that to build every single session. So this is an MVP model. If this had to be put by a university, the approach would have been very different and perhaps required more resources and more, both in terms of time and energy, from a product to market sort of timeline. And that's the approach that personally we like to take, which is work with what you have, layer in everybody's inputs as you go along, and keep letting the process evolve as it grows and takes shape. So I'm just going to throw the next version up. So what we just want you to do is very similar to what we did in the last session, is just groups of 3, and the teams already put the groups together. It's a 15-minute session, you get 5 minutes each. And all you have to do is discuss the goals with respect to your audiences. If you can just put down 1 or 2 key goals that you have, and it could cut across development and engagement. Don't dwell on those terms too much. Just ask yourself, what are your goals for your audiences? And identify 1 or 2 segments that you may want to talk about. The key thing, like I was mentioning here, is just take those 5 minutes, and in that 5 minutes, just share what you have to share, but also listen. And whoever is listening, please give feedback as well. So that would be key. If you've already filled the form and you have a copy of your responses, you can also use that, but just use this space to think through some of these questions. With that, we can move into the breakout rooms, Dipti. I hope these 15 minutes gave you a chance to sort of explore where you are with your audiences and some thoughts around it. I'm just going to share now the next section of our presentation. This is specifically looking at digital audiences and how do you correlate the physical to the digital. So before we talk a little bit more about the factors that are relevant to digital audiences, I wanted to talk about this theory, which I often use in my work, is the cute cat theory of digital activism. So it was by Ethan Zuckerman a few years ago, spoke about comparing Web 1.0 and 2.0, and I think we've gone way beyond 2.0 now. So the focus for that theory was that Web 1.0 was invented to allow physicists to share research papers. I mean, how the internet was birthed and how did it evolve. And as internet evolved, it grew, people got PCs. You had these platforms where people could share information, including like posting vacancies of flats and rooms in flats. There was also a huge surge in sharing photographs of cute cats. And that's where this theory comes through. But the point that Ethan was trying to make here is there is a platform which are low value platforms, in the sense a lot of people are using those platforms to share pictures of cute cats. And a platform is a platform. It's a tool that allows you to put whatever you want out there. If the government tries to shut down a smaller magazine, online magazine, or a platform mainly used by digital activists, there may not be that much of a hue and cry. But if the government tries to shut down a very popular platform, which is also being used to share pictures of cute cats and put out information of protests, there'll be a far higher hue and cry, and inevitably you'll also have the cute cat picture sharing community become a part of the larger activism community, so to speak. So he was broadly talking about your relationship with the platform, and what you choose to do with that platform. So with that, I just wanted to sort of get us to think a little bit more about our relationship with the digital, which is what we covered in the first two sessions with Dipti, with Padmini and Nishant, and just wanted us to think a little bit about what are the factors that influence the relationship of the audiences with the digital. So here are the six factors: the devices that they use. Do I have a phone? Do I have a laptop? What am I using to engage with the digital? Am I using, an FM radio, whatever that might be? What technological contexts of that relationship? Platforms, of course. Are we using a video meeting platform like Zoom or a social media platform? What are those platforms like? How are we reaching the audiences? How is the audience reaching us? What are their behaviors like online? Much like physical behaviors. What are influencing them? What are the influencing factors that are important in this mix? And what are their motivations? So, the first connection points are doors and stages. Devices are your doors to the platforms, which are the stages, if you think of it from that context. The reach, how you reach the audience, how the audience reaches you, what are the touch points, will determine the way they get to the doors, and then from the doors to the stages. So what is that pathway like? What are the touch points that you have to the audience's devices, so to speak? What about reach and influences? Who is the influencer that's showing you the path to that particular road? Are those influences coming from a social capital space, which is your parents who probably took you to classical music concerts as a child? Or is that something that you learned about in college when you're a part of a theater group? What about someone you follow on social media who may recommend something? What about a critic who has recommended a certain play and you're like, maybe I should catch that? Who are the influences that are setting you on to those pathways? But at the same time, even if I have Amitabh Bachchan saying to me that cover your nose and mouth while coughing, is that enough? That may tell me that I should do that in order to, make sure that I don't catch an infection. But will that motivate me to get to that door eventually? So, what are those motivations that the audiences have online that lead you to pick up that device and choose to engage with the art form? And finally, what about the online behaviors? Padmini had said, I think Nishant had said that there aren't 7,000 people, there are 7,000 terminals. So, what is the behavior of this online community that you have the online audiences to have, and how do you convert them into passive consumers to someone who can engage and absorb your content or work with you with a certain amount of engagement, where they're absorbing what you're presenting to them? That final aspect of how they are behaving online, how they are experiencing your work online, will is an equally important factor while you're thinking about digital audiences. What is there in the digital space, including audience? And if you can draw out some commonalities and departure points in the physical and the digital, that'll be great. Just while doing that, also keep in mind, if you can identify 2 or 3 key touch points. Actually, if you can identify as many touch points as possible, that'll be great. And what you could also do is, while discussing that, just make sure that you're looking at prioritizing them. So if you're, for instance, your audience touch point is, we'd mentioned earlier, like a WhatsApp message or a newsletter, how important is that going to be for bunkers, goals to be achieved. If their goals are, to create a certain amount of a kind of engagement with a certain kind of audience. And it'll be good if you can just sort of think through what the criteria are that you're using. And finally, if you were in Bunker's positions, what decisions would you need to take with respect to staff training and upskilling to meet the AD challenges, in, of course, relation to digital? So, much like you've done earlier, if one person in the group or two people in the group could put this on a PowerPoint, it'll be easier for you to come back and share this with us. So what we're going to be doing is, yes, it is the quote of 2020. We've got 3 minutes for each of the groups to make their presentations. So we can, Dipti, shall we start with any random group number?
3.
Group number 3.
Yeah. So hi. So the first question around the case was like, how would you correlate Bunker's audience development and engagement goals in the physical realm with the digital needs? So draw out commonalities and departure points. So basically, the commonality that we sort of discussed were basically, once you read the case, you figure out that Bunker is not really sort of digitally savvy. So they do need to prioritize their, how and where, what kind of touch points do they need to go like sort of digital, and what kind of audiences do they need to target? Because in the physical space, they were working with a lot of professionals, and they were working with experts in their fields. But now if they're going digital, then how do they like recreate the shows that they were doing in the physical space, and B, also like look at new avenues, like the touch points, like what we identified was schools and communities, neighborhoods. How do you reach out to these guys? So in the digital spaces. So yeah, I mean, that was one. The departure point that we kind of figured was, it's written in the case that Bunker, they were sort of changing the mode of operation, the kind of production and the curatorial decisions. So and they also operated from this electric this space like the space station substation. So now they, like in the case, it says that they want to now go into the communities and start working there. So that is sort of, we thought that's one departure point. And yeah, we did discuss another departure point, but I didn't get time to write. Kumam can maybe add that departure point. Kumam, can you help me out?
You have 2 more questions to cover, huh?
Oh, sorry.
So I think just to summarize the 2 departure points that we thought was that they were looking for now projects that could be more locally produced, and the other was adopting a more transdisciplinary approach, and also I mean, I personally suspect that there's a shift from a more participatory process to a more I don't know what's the word, I mean, to a less participatory process, because the shift from from physical to the digital definitely kind of calls for a shift. Yeah.
You have about 20 seconds.
Cool. So for the second question, like as it's mentioned in the case, that Bunker's strategy was never like to be top down. It was always like bottoms up. So they wanted to they wanted more people to be sort of involved in their projects. So right, like Kumam said, and like it said in the case, that now they are going into the communities, into the neighborhoods. So I guess the second question, this answers the second question, that the criteria for using these, like to prioritize these touch points, is now they are going to their audiences. So now they need to find those sort of, lighthouse places where their audiences are.
I've got some notes written down. I can do this quick.
Thank you, Varun. Thank you.
Okay, so very quickly, one of the first things we noticed was these guys have 9 employees, 35 volunteers, and an 800,000 euro budget, which is publicly funded, which means these programs are not revenue generating programs. They're not meant to actually build an audience through ticket sales. So that gives you a big amount of leeway. What that also led us to understand was that when you try to see their touch points when it comes to an audience, these are working professionals who are autodidactic. There's also not an audience that's interested in contemporary arts, but who are interested in their local references, because programs they built with local artists were effective, were successful. The schools are also insufficiently developed when it comes to culture and tech. So if these are your audience touch points, you know that education is going to be a big part of it. Now, when it came to solutions, I think we had quite a few and we had a variation. I mean, I think Ganishka was the one who also even suggested using radio broadcast as a way of reaching out to audiences, which I thought was fascinating. We also had the fact that it mentions that they already had an existing infrastructure of using conferences, forums, and gatherings and festivals to learn. So hosting this on digital platforms would be the next natural step, but that would involve training. But then again, they only have 9 employees and 35 volunteers. So training them isn't exactly like a huge amount of people either. But then really, they have to continue building these local projects because that's what's bringing them success. That's what's getting them an audience. And they have to use collaborations to incorporate audience participation. It said very specifically that when audiences participate, and these are formats that have come from collaborations outside, what they've learned, these are things you can do digitally. You can continue to learn this and offer this and even approach local artists to build digitally. Mota mota this.
Yeah, so one of the things that we first discussed is what are the challenges that the digital media can have. One was with age, in terms of that a lot of the connoisseurs that Bunker had might not be so used to the digital platform or might not find it so interesting to invest in it. And the second thing that we thought was that the different kinds of events that they were doing might get kind of muddled up when they are all being put together in the digital space. The third thing was in terms of also creating these events, they would now require a completely new set of ways of doing the events, which are very different from doing something physically. So whether with the small team that they have, and the kind of, as I think someone else also put it, that the events don't seem to be very, generating revenues in terms of that. Are they comfortable as well as are they able financially also to take that leap? So that was the first question. I'm kind of, someone's adding a third point. I don't think that is from my group. The second question was, I think the challenges are the second question, right? I'm sorry, I can't seem to find the questions. The third,
touch point.
Yeah, sorry. Touch point. So one of the touch points I think that we kind of all agreed on is that what Bunker already had is to work is a built-in community and which they can do what I think Artex did with us when we started something, when we started this, is to have these tech sessions with them, like to get people involved in the process of this digitization so that they also feel a part of this new platform that Bunker was creating for itself. So what it does is it also retains interest. And the second thing is the audience also feels like a part of the investment. So there's more of a chance of them to actually come up and support this initiative rather than say that, oh no, it's a new thing, so we don't know about it. And the third question. Okay, then if I can just, if anyone else wants to add, I'm sorry, I made like really short notes. So,
and I'll add for the third question quickly. Yeah. So the third question we looked at, and the third question we addressed from aspects of safety, removing the fear of usage of technology and introducing technology organically. Looking at different audiences, different events, and not using one technology for every single person, or looking at the nature of the event and figuring out a technology, but creating a kind of basically what we figured in these last couple of months also is that a lot of people have fear and apprehension to use technology. So if we can remove that and address it from multiple level points of elderly, young people, so the nature of the event will then define the kind of technology that we use. And one more thing was when we are looking at staff training, if we could also look at opportunities to work at different organizations and co-learn, co-share, which is a model that happens outside of India. But you work in a different organization, you understand their audience, and you take back the sharing versus that person comes into your organization, works, and gives you new insights, new perspectives. So if we have the opportunity to co-learn and co-share learnings and insights.
So thank you so much for sharing all of this. I mean, it's really diverse in terms of what you all came up with. There were some commonalities I saw. I'm just going to run through them really quick. So from whatever you shared in terms of the first question about where are the commonalities, what came through very clearly is you first started with what is it that's at the core of Bunker's offering, right? What is their strength? And that's something that I was very happy to hear that all of you pretty much stuck to. And takes me back to that first question of what's your goal for the audiences? Where are you coming from? Why you? Why your offering? So asking that question and connecting it to, as you also pointed out, some of you pointed out, who is the audience? Are they loyal? Are they young people? So connecting your offering to your audience was clearly one thread that came through a lot with what you were sharing with us today, and also seemed to come through very clearly in your discussions. The second question about what the touch points are, I felt that most of you had very varied understanding of touch points, which is also a good thing because those roads could be several. And depending on who you're approaching, which group are you approaching, those touch points could differ. But instead of talking about touch points, what I'm going to talk about is a lot of you identified barriers. You said funding is a barrier. You said tech access is a barrier. You said learning is a barrier. But I didn't hear that as a problem. I heard a very solution oriented approach to what you were thinking as well. So as you were talking about funding, you thought about what the EU has to offer, what the condition of the artists are, what they can do, what is it that you already hold as assets that you could amplify, for instance, your current relationships or certain strengths within your team. So what was nice to hear about those touch points also is once you recognize those touch points, once you recognize the barriers, you are able to get past the overwhelmingness of that barrier while thinking about audiences or digital. And the third thing that came through in what you were saying, and of course I'm being very generalist here, is I could hear the use of the word collaboration a lot. So just collaborative possibilities. I wish you'd have opened this conversation up a little more, but I understand 20 minutes is not enough. But you spoke about transdisciplinary approaches. Most of us in the arts may not be as familiar with tech, but tech people are. And that's, I think, what Archana was also trying to speak about day before yesterday is why can't we look at these cross, not genre, but literally disciplinary collaborations and conversations where you don't have to build the resource in-house, but look at someone from another sector who could come in and help you think through some of those ideas. So really take away this notion of collaboration. And it's so much more important now in 2020 as we see. There were elements of it that came through in what you shared, but these are the key things that I took away from our conversation and what you shared. I'm just going to run through the last few slides and then we can move on to questions. So we just finished sharing. I'm going to just throw a few data points. So this is something that we work a little bit with Paytm Insider. So there's some data points that they shared with us on how are they looking at their audience. I mean, there's a lot more that you have in terms of how often is your audience engaged with you online. This is mainly from the online consumption that they've been doing the last few months. So we had asked them for information on how is the online audience behaving in terms of purchase behaviors, in terms of what their preferences are, how often, like if they're coming to an event, for how long are they staying for an event. But this was all like the big data questions, right? We didn't really ask them who their audience is. But this is some of the data that came through, and I just thought I could share this with you in case it thinking about, looking at your audiences online. So one is, of course, purchasing power and what they're willing to pay. And the other is what their preferences are in terms of the kind of events that their audience is accessing on their platform, being very specific about it. So just with that, I wanted to move on to the third part and sort of bring in some of the learnings from the last 5 sessions together as provocation statements. As you start thinking about your audience journey, your relationships with them, the potential audience that you want to build, the desire to continue to engage with the current audience and bring in the repeatability, the need for you to deepen the relationship with your existing audience, I'd like us to think about some of these statements, right? The first being audience as big data. this is something that we spoke about quite a bit with Nishant and Padmini about your relationship with the digital. Who is the author? How are you making work? How is it that it's being received? What about access to the work in terms of rights? How are we looking at the whole notion of who is absorbing, how they using, how they recycling your thinking, your work into their way of thinking and learning? And the questions of big data are far more complex than that. But I just wanted to leave this thought around, who are you speaking to? Having a 10,000 Instagram following base, how is that different from speaking to that one person? For me, this also connects in some sense with what Achal had shared about, at the heart of it, aside from the mechanizations around segmentation, engagement, development, all of those dynamics, at the heart of it, who's that one audience member that you want to get? And how do you build that relationship with them? If you just break that down into that one profile, how easy or hard that process is going to be. So, how do you relook at the notion of big data through the lens of a single person and humanize that data set is a pathway that you need to think about for yourself. The second one was audience as market, and Bella Fidel said that it's good that people see it. It's even better when they love it, and it's wonderful if they buy it. And I thought that for me, this was always a quote that I like. It's a wonderful quote because it allows you to sort of look at that transition across, or not as conflict points, but all as a part of that one value chain, right? You will have an audience member that will see it and appreciate it. Your connoisseur may not be the highest, your highest target market for buying. It may be your novice, but that very fluid relationship between audience as rasika and audience as market is again a pathway that you need to negotiate and think about. If your goals for the audience is going to be engagement or development, how do you sort of soften that tension with eventually what you're offering is, and what is it that you want to achieve at the end of it? And with Archana, and we spoke a lot about community. I was really happy to hear, even in this session, a lot of you spoke about community. And this is something personally we are leaning towards a lot, is what is a community? Is it about giving them what they want? Is it about really listening to their needs? Are we just giving them what we want to give them, which is a project on WhatsApp? Are we thinking about what they need? What does that audience development on a lateral level look like? But also, more importantly, it's a connection that grows, right? Like it's not something, it's not a blood relationship. It's not like it's family and then you have to deal with them and you have to give them time, but it's a relationship that grows with time. How is it that you are responsive in this relationship? How do you create in this response? And how does this then relate back to your artist, who may want to put herself, himself, themselves independent of the notion of what the audience wants? Those tensions, Nuhar earlier on in the chat spoke about, as a culture manager, who's my audience? I think my audience, the artist will have an audience. What is my audience? And I just want to give this back to a certain extent to you. Nuhar, it's about how, it's not about who your artist's audience is, but if there is work that you're putting out there, who is mostly relating to the work? Who do you want for that work to relate to? Those are questions that you need to ask yourself, even as a manager, because you are that crucial link between the artwork and the audience. So you're not independent of that process. It's not like the artist and the art is directly talking to the audience. Your role in this entire process is very crucial. So your role across these provocations of translating the big data set to the single audience member, humanizing them, your role from looking at the audience as market to the audience as a rasika, and your role from looking at audience as audience and audience as community is crucial to this entire process. So I just wanted I just wanted to leave us with these three provocation statements, and happy to share these as well. As you go ahead and think about, there are lots of tools out there around audience development and marketing, and I'm happy to share a ton for you as well. But eventually it's these pathways that you take as a manager And I'm sure a lot of you are artists on this group as well, but you also change your role into that of a manager, depending on what level are you at with your project or your work. And your role is as crucial in the process of building that long-term relationship with that audience and defining the role of your work, your artist's work with the audience. So just to then finally recap, what we ended up doing today was we sort of looked at existing approaches of audience development, engagement, and segmentation. As you navigate online, talk to each other, this grammar, this lexicon will give you some reference points to think through, and hopefully will on the one hand may not allow you to get entirely overwhelmed, but on the other hand also relate some of these concepts to how some of these concepts are actually spoken about in the digital realm, in the FMCG realm, in other areas of thinking through consumers, audiences, users, whatever those words might be. But it just gives you the grammar and the structure to think about that. We also examined the peculiarities of digital audiences. So we didn't get into analytics, and we didn't get into notions of, impressions and all of that. You have enough to look at, but eventually, how is your audience behaving online? What are their devices? How are they approaching you? What does your stage look like? How do you define that experience? How do you ensure that the pathways and the influences and the motivations are being addressed while engaging with them? All framing your audiences online. And again, it's not very far away from how they look at you physically as well. And finally, these provocations that'll help you take a hopefully will help you take a much more proactive and empowered role into thinking about audiences and not reactive. And it's a pathway that you can choose, because you are finally connecting. You are the differentiator between the mass and I would say to a certain extent the class, in the sense of not looking at things in a meta way, but also thinking about micro uh, iterations and improvements and evolution through that process.
So my relationship with audience is twofold. One, as audience of the arts myself and consuming certain kinds of arts. And second, is from a curiosity point of view, looking at the kinds of audiences I've seen across the country at different events, different kinds of events. I've always wondered, how do we get the corporate kind of audiences in the crowd? Because they have the money. So the guys with all the unicorn, the tech, the startup world, how do you engage that audience, the younger millennials, into the arts, because they can contribute. And I've been reading a lot of articles in the lockdown in the last few months. This audience is actually spending a lot on visual art. So a lot of the visual art galleries have been seeing purchases from the most unexpected kind of lot. It's not been their usual, along with their usual customers. These people have been buying art. So they are consuming art in some manner. They're watching animation, they're reading graphic novels, they're consuming certain kinds of music. So my question again is, how do you bring them and interest them in the kind of arts that we have in our country at all kinds of levels, and get them to support the arts because they have the money bags?
Yeah. So that's the golden ticket question, right? Like, I think every arts organization wants to be like, how do we get them to pay, and how do we get them to come? And this is where I think let's go back to the first part of the presentation. We spoke about audience development and audience engagement, right? So let's define our goals first. What do you want them to do? Do you want them to come and see your work, or do you want them to come and subscribe to your organization? Do you want them to pay you? Like, what are the goals? And if those are the goals that you have, who is it that you want to reach with the goals? You've said millennials. You've also said corporates. They could be two different target groups, or they could be similar groups, right? So just having a clear sense of where they stand. And what I'm talking about is typical audience development approaches. Try and bring in some of the really interesting insights that, for instance, that Achal shared. Where do they lie? Because if you look at these segments, if I've got a millennial, now a millennial can be someone who's actually come from a creative program or education space. In India, currently the highest number of intake when it comes to education in the last 5 years has been in liberal arts. It's not been in medicine. It's not been in engineering. It's not even been in business. It's liberal arts. If you look at the number of liberal arts colleges that have gone up in the country. So when you're talking about a young audience that's interested in arts, for me, it's not surprising. You have to map that onto meta trends as to what's going on everywhere else in the world and in the country. You've got an explosion of visual culture thanks to the internet and thanks to social media. When you're talking about an explosion of visual culture, that visual culture is resonating with visual, it's also building a visual aesthetic in very different ways, as well as music, right? Because both of them have some resonance in our traditional structures of digital, which relate to this. Padmini's presentation spoke about that, and the fact that there's very little work done around the performative in the digital space, and that's real, and that's going to change in the next 3 years. With the pandemic, the entire performative is going to change, like access to performative, engagement with performative is going to change, because finally you've got the impetus to create innovation into the performative in the digital space. So somewhere needs to be a balance of understanding who is it that you're trying to target, where are they situated in that meta context? And the meta context doesn't necessarily need to come from data. It could come from you just looking around. The amazing thing about the creative community, what I often find is really rewarding, is that we have an ability to think transdisciplinary. We just never acknowledge it, because we're constantly deriving influences from across the world, right? Across disciplines. And if we just bring that back into understanding what's going on in the world, and then relate that back to is that what your audience is responding to, that gives you a sense of possibly what their needs and motivations and behaviors could be. And then correlate that with whatever data you can find online. So coming back to your corporate audience and your millennial audience, it's likely that a corporate audience will look for that stimulation. They don't have the time. They're spending 2 to 3 hours traveling every day when they're in an urban space. If that's their time, where do they fit into those categories? Do they have enough time to engage with you? If they don't have enough time to engage with you, what aspects of the behavior are you targeting? How are you ensuring that they're coming to a play that you're are you giving them a post-event networking session, a date meetup, a drinks thing after? Like, what are you doing so that they get that stimulation to be able to hang out with friends after? Why do they like going to a music or a comedy gig? Because they can have a drink, they can have a bite, they can combine these two things, right? So just understanding those behaviors might make you layer what you're offering them very differently, and perhaps create an engagement aspect, or rather a development aspect that you may not have thought of. But the engagement is where you take a step further and say, can I convert them to subscribers? Make sure that you don't have any dead ends. So if they're coming to you, get their email ID. Hey, would you like to become a patron? What would you like? What are their needs? How do you understand those needs? Like by getting your feedback after every session, we are constantly looking at what your needs are. And then we're able to respond to it, which is what helps us build a relationship with you. And it takes energy and effort. It's not, don't think of it as something that will happen overnight. But just this
long process.
It's a long process, yeah. But my point is, a lot of that can be shared between us. And that's why I feel like the community really matters. One of the data points that I was looking at a few years ago was remarkable, because in Europe, because so much of the arts is funded by public money, you actually have audience insights from 137 cultural organizations. We have nothing. We have a Book My Show that does not give us our own audience data. It's something I've been fighting with for like 5 years with them, right? So it's those are the kind of dynamics that we're dealing with. And if you're able to sort of just self-empower and talk to each other to be like, okay, what do you know about your audience? And engagement, segmentation. So at least we're speaking in a similar language and can talk in a similar language and build something together. Slightly longer response to your, actually not very a short question either. But I hope this gives you some sense of how you engage with them. Within that, I would say bring in the filter that Achal has brought to us, that within your millennials also, there'll be your amateurs, your novices, and your connoisseurs. And it's that one person out of the 10,000, if you convert them, that's very rewarding for your artist. And it's the 8,000 that will come as novices, which will give you something else. Let's not paint them in the same brush either. Yeah.
Yeah, hi, Rashmi. It's sort of an extension to what you just said, what my question was around. That when you're trying to, let's say, appease to, let's say a particular age group, but that age group consists of all three, categories: connoisseurs, amateurs, and novices. And specifically moving into the digital world, when you're trying to, put out a set of information where you feel that, okay, it's very crucial to, process that you undertake in creating your artwork, and something you know for sure that a connoisseur would definitely relate to and associate and appreciate. But a novice or a amateur might not have the bandwidth to, or the patience to, go through that whole journey. How, and as Anchal also mentioned, that novices are the ones who would probably actually be willing to throw off a lot of their money based on what the culture is. How do you plan your digital outreach in a scenario like that? Like with Bunker also, I felt the same, that they have so many different kind of varied kind of audiences in physical spaces, and moving into digital, they would also be doing anything and everything, and trying to reach out to every audience might not be the wisest thing to do, because then it's just a khichdi which no, it's not palatable to any of those groups. So how do you pick and choose, which one is more worthy of, reaching out to in the first place, and then expecting good returns as well as a result of it?
So two things, right? Like one is a response directly to how you're thinking about these three groups. Are you thinking of these three groups as independent of each other, or do they have relationships with each other?
I think independent of each other.
Okay.
Because of their economical or educational backgrounds, they do vary quite a bit.
Sure. I'm going to bring up two examples. One is, if you've seen Devil Wears Prada, there's this one scene where Meryl Streep talks about, this entire the periwinkle blue sweater and how it comes down to the novel. You'll actually go to the store and see. So that relationship between the connoisseur deciding what's that color and how it comes down, that is actually the cycle, according to me, what Achal was talking about. So if you think of them as independent groups, maybe a disservice, because the connoisseur may also be an influencer.
True.
Right? They may be influencing tastes. And even though they may not be paying that kind of money. So it may be useful to just think of the continuum of value as opposed to brackets of value. Don't think of audience segments as a way of, to help you reach them in the way they prefer to be reached. Okay. As opposed to bracketing them and only giving them, something that they want.
Right.
Because this will always put you in conflict with your artist as well. Your artist is not creating for the novel. He or she or they are probably creating for the connoisseur.
Yeah.
So it's your job, therefore, that once the work comes, how do you filter it into these groups with the entire value chain at play? Touchpoints here become really important. Right. So that entire digital peculiarity cycle, just think about that. Where do they fit into that framework? The second area that I'm going to ask you to look at is actually the tech space, which may require a little more tech literacy or digital literacy for you. Is I'm going to share with you later on Dara a link to what's the job of an audience development manager in a magazine. And they look at like a digital audience development manager, and I'll send you that link. It's quite complex, but the thing about what I find interesting about digital is that it allows you to do this micro targeting. So if you look at Cambridge Analytica and what they managed to do, right, micro targeting to certain groups, and the digital space allows you to do that. So it allows you to also do A/B testing. So if you're able to create one sort of creative for one community, which is a connoisseur community, and a different kind of a creative for the novice community, that messaging can also change. And it allows you to target those different communities in an online space. Right. As opposed to traditional media where you could only put one ad in one Bombay Times or whatever that was, or you could only send one WhatsApp message to, we think of messaging as singular. We don't think of messaging as customized. And that customization is what, to a certain extent, digital allows us to do with a little more flexibility than the traditional media. So if you think of the ability of those devices I was talking about, what devices are they using and what ability does it give you to customize and target that audience, that will help you keep your product the same. It won't let you influence the product, and it may actually inform some of the additional layers to the product that you might want to add. But at the same time, it allows you to tell people what they are looking for. I want to buy a shirt and I'm very concerned about ironing.
Right.
And someone else wants to buy a shirt and they're very concerned about sweat. Would you give them different messages? Or would I tell someone who's concerned about sweat and ironing?
Yeah, of course, about the both.
Digital allows you to do. It allows you to address that need in a particular targeted fashion. Well, at least the tools allow you to do that. There's also danger.
So Varun had reshared a question in chat, and because you've pasted it in chat, Varun, I'm going to read it out for you. This is for people who responded to the quiz. I'm wondering how the majority of respondents to the survey asked their audience about their household or personal income information. And then, of course, there is more conversation, but I think we'll stick to that question for now, and then we'll go to Srinidhi after that.
So, I mean, I don't know if I should be answering the question, because I think Varun's question was for the entire group. But what I can say is when we put the question in the quiz, Varun, I think the idea was to get you to think about that response, like how do you know your audience? And even if you may not have directly sought those responses from your audience. Again, I don't know how many people in the group here actually put out feedback forms after to find out what it is. Or there are things that you can identify also. Like, I'll give you an example. We were consulting with a theater group a couple of years ago, and we made sure that they were given feedback forms after at the end of every session, where we looked at age group, we looked at profession, we looked at where they are living, and through that we managed to build a picture that approximately they'll fall into this socioeconomic category in terms of income. Right? So it was derivative as opposed to direct. There are other ways that you can get that information, including things like census data, profession, average mean income in that respective city. There are other big data bits that you can look at to triangulate and get that information. Obviously, like I said, it takes a lot of work to do that. So most of this data, you're not likely to get it directly. It may be derivative. But the objective of asking that question was to get people to think about that, right? Because who your audience is and what their income is really going to determine what are you offering them, what languages they are speaking in. As a museum, my audience is going to be economically disadvantaged communities, which are young audiences coming from perhaps state schools, right? As opposed to higher education or like IB schools. And that really forces me to think, why am I offering them guided tours in Hindi and no other material in Hindi? So it makes you think of those questions, and it makes you go back to your core question of what is it that your goal is? Is your goal only to address IB communities? So, it sort of makes you go back into asking yourself some essentialist questions. And I think that's what the objective of this was. But also when you're creating or thinking through your segmentation, income becomes a huge part of that, because it allows you to understand where to peg on where to put value for your work in terms of ticketing and otherwise. Even for sponsors, for instance, I'm getting a certain class of audience and hence I'm asking you for this amount of money. So it allows you to think about your value in articulating it to your audiences, but also to your stakeholders.
Mm-hmm. I absolutely agree, but because that's why I was asking how they came about the information when you respond, because it's, again, like Ra mentioned, you can take consent for getting this information, but like, for example, quite a few of our, if we use geographical location, quite a few of them don't work. Their parents are actually paying. How are you actually affording to attend a cultural event? If I work in mental health, then I need to balance the idea of, you really need this, but at the same time, can you afford it? How many slots do I keep that are for subsidized people? If I have 15 slots, do I keep 3 subsidized or 5? But I would never ask them, how much do you make specifically on a feedback form? And I don't know who would answer that, but that's why I'm surprised, because I did note that, okay, I never asked my people, and that was an other response. But when I saw the survey, I'm like, there's a lot of responses here. So how did you get that information? Especially because I was the only one who put feedback in surveys as how I get my information. No one else marked that as an option in the survey. So where did you get that info? That's why I'm asking.
Yeah. The other thing that I do want to talk about when it comes to data, I think we can have an entire class on data collection and analytics, because it's an entire animal on its own. But one of the ways to think about that information as well, about understanding what their income is, or for instance, location, the parents giving the money, this is where we talk about what we call false positives in data, right? Where you don't rely on data always in its entirety, ever. Trust your intuition, think of qualitative indicators, what we call triangulation. Like if a data point is telling you that my average mean income of my audience is 5 to 10 lakhs, and if it's only one data point that's giving you, which is feedback forms, there's a problem. And if you're going to make your decisions on the basis of that data point, it's a problem, because no data set is completely, it's not in an economic sense. Ceteris paribus is a thing in economics, right? Which is all things remaining same. It's never like that. So you always figure out a way of triangulating that information. Is that so? If I'm living in Bombay, is the average income 5 to 10 lakhs? I don't believe it. Maybe their income is 5 to 10 lakhs, but their net worth is much higher because they're living with parents. And they are probably under 25 years old, which is why it's 5 to 10 lakhs, because that's what you would earn if you're under 25 years old. So you start asking yourselves that question and bring in that qualitative aspect of who your audience is through your own internal conversations. And even then you may be wrong, but it's better than having no data and no understanding.
Yeah.
And it's perhaps not as good as having the ideal understanding of your audience, but it's also an evolving process. It also keeps changing.
I'll give you a small example of exactly that, because we had people who came for a workshop, and there was someone who always asked for a subsidized rate. And in the digital era, about 2 months ago, he came to a session again, and we had given him a ticket, and he said, "Oh, my connection is not so good. I'm in my house in Pondi." We're like, "Wait a minute, man. Like, how do you have a house in Pondicherry that's your house, and you're not paying for these sessions, and you're taking a scholarship slot?" And then we found out his family owns this business, but he doesn't want to ask his parents for the money. And we're like, yeah, but there's someone who can't afford to be here, and you're shy about asking your parents. There's a difference. But asking that question is exactly like you're saying. We couldn't rely on all the data to kind of ask that question.
Yeah, thanks so much for the session. My first question was answered with your Rasika reference. Like, that is such a beautiful analogy. Like, changing from the social dilemma thing of a drug addict user to this Rasika as the connoisseur. That's such a change of perspective. So really thanks for that analogy. So we were discussing in the chat section, like, how do you kind of understand what are the ethics around collecting data? Because offline, I can be okay if they don't give consent, right? If they don't tell me their income, I'm okay with it. But here, I can collect a lot of their fingerprints without their consent. So anyway, I'm overwhelmed with these data points about their location, about so many different, their age, their pricing bracket, how frequently they do it. So how, as a tech startup, you can just do whatever you want with data, even buy data if it's out in the market in the dark web. But how do you navigate around it ethically in the cultural space, especially because you're dealing with really sensitive stuff? Like, I'm about the ethics, I'm kind of torn about digital collection of data.
So Srinidhi, thank you. I mean, I want to thank you for asking that question, because it's something that is so important in the arts, right? Particularly because we work with different notions of influence. And one of the reasons actually why, one of the arguments against having culture policy in India is also the same thing, right? Our ability as people in the arts to influence public opinion, and hence policy was kept away from the policymakers, which is the politicians, so that they're not able to influence the way people think and behave. So questions of ethics are really huge when it comes to the arts in this country. And with data in particular, it's even bigger. I would recommend that you ask this question to Nishant on Tuesday. Mainly because he used to work with Center for Internet and Society, and these are questions he's dealt with very, very intensely in his space. So he would be actually, from a theoretical point of view and even the larger meta context point of view, he would be far better in responding to that. From my perspective, which comes from A, running an arts organization, B, being a part of a larger arts organization that's working with performances and audiences, the way we try to navigate with that question is always seek consent when you're using people's data. So if you're asking for a feedback, you're asking them to fill a feedback form, always have, are you willing for us to use this information or contact you again? By the virtue of the fact that they're filling their own feedback form, you are ticking off, there is consent involved. The principles, these are the principles that we follow. Make sure it's informed consent. You're giving them the information about how the data is going to be used. Whatever platform you're collecting that data from. So when you're looking at it online, there is usually a data policy that is there. Second, while thinking of that, there are simpler data policies that you can look at. I think the GDPR is a reasonably decent one, where every time you use that person's data, you have to ask them, I think you have to periodically update their consent. So just think through some of those parameters, and whatever you can replicate within the capacities that you have, try and do it. there are those meta narratives of data protection and privacy that are there. Second, like I said, is informed consent. Always say that, I'm using your data for this organization. Third, think about sharing. Who are you sharing the data with? Who are your stakeholders that have asked for the data and that are going to use that data? If they've asked for the data and they're going to use the data, make sure the liability of seeking permission again is on them. And especially if it's being used for commercial reasons, make sure there's some amount of retribution involved for the person who's given the data themselves. Like, for instance, if you're selling the data, it's a huge problem, right? So there are values and ethics within that which you don't need a rule book to tell you. You can instinctively understand. So going back, look at the meta level policies that exist, see if there's any reflection within that you can maintain. Make sure informed consent is there at every stage. If you're collecting a physical feedback form, if it's on your website, there are lots of data privacy and consent templates that are available that you can use as well. And the third is, if you're sharing that information with someone, what are their motivations and what are their responsibilities and accountabilities towards accessing that information? So one example is that your information, if you've collected in a form, in the end, we'll always ask, by filling this form, you're consenting to data to be shared by us and Max Mueller Bhavan. So we've clearly asked for your consent with two different organizations. And that is one practice that we follow, so that you're fully aware that you're sharing this data with them. At the same time, once we have your data with us, we're in the process actually of making sure that every time a new, even though you've given your consent, we put out a form, an email to you saying that you've been added to the database through this event, please reconfirm. So we do that, so there is double consent, right? Sometimes there are mistakes and stuff. So there are certain practices that you can bring in also around sharing and again, seeking consent again. And finally, just going back to what your values are. As an organization, even if there are 4 or 5 values, is it equality and diversity, whatever that might be, if there are any of those values that resonate with your relationship with data and audiences that you've not thought about, bring that into that process of data use and data transfer if you need to. So for instance, if the values are that you're going to protect all of this, make sure that all of your employees within your organization are ascribing to the same values and are using it in the same way. So just connecting it back to your own organization and what it stands for is going to be equally important within that process. So that's what I can speak of from the perspective of an organization and an individual. But there are layers into that conversation around ethics, which I think it'll be better if we discuss it on the 15th.
That's awesome. Like, that really informs me, because I think that's the takeaway of the whole fellowship, which is I'm able to really implement these things. Like at every second, like whenever these points are told, I can see those tangible changes I can make at various levels, personally, at organizational level, and in our platform. And that is super awesome, because I am having an entire podcast on rasas and especially focusing on Shringara rasa. But I never considered as applying those principles in users. Like, that's mind blowing. So I'm like, these connections between tech and arts, like I've never made, like, all those walls are getting broken, and it's such beautiful intersections. So thanks a lot. Thank you for the whole session.
Thank you, Srinidhi.
Rashmi, would you like to wrap up this session?
No, I think the wrap up was just your queries, because I've already done that with the provocation statements for my wrap up. Is about what pathways you take and what choices do you make along the way. But thank you so much again for staying through and coming back with your questions, and very important questions. It makes us also think a lot about how we want to go ahead with these contexts as well. So thanks.